So we will go ahead and get started. So we're going to toggle back to Thrust C again, research activities, with a presentation from Dr. Jessica Bolson at the Southeast Environmental Research Center at Florida International University. Thrust C explores how cities can intentionally foster the widespread adoption of infrastructure, development patterns, consumer behaviors, and management practices that advance sustainable water management. To understand overcoming barriers to adoption of sustainable solutions, the social and behavioral systems that govern change are investigated under this research thrust. So our webinar schedule and details are posted on the UWIN calendar, which can be accessed through the main menu of our website. And as always, we'll continue to record each webinar and post them to the YouTube channel and then distribute the link as soon as it's available. As a reminder, all participants have entered muted, so please use the questions, or please enter your questions in the chat queue, and we will address them at the end of Jessica's presentation. So be sure to tune back in next week for a presentation from Dr. Neil Gregg at Colorado State University. He's going to be discussing financial models and strategies to support the transition to One Water. And with that, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Jessica Bolson, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Southeast Environmental Research Center at Florida International University. She conducts research on water resource management decisions and transitions to sustainability through the NSF-funded Urban Water Innovation Network. Prior, Jessica was a postdoctoral fellow in the Risk Management and Decision Processes Center at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, where she coordinated the South Florida Water Sustainability and Climate Project and leads the project's behavioral research team. In addition to her research, she has taught graduate and undergraduate level courses in climate and society environmental policy at the University of Miami and Florida International University. Jessica received a PhD in environmental science and policy from the University of Miami's Abscess Center in 2010. Her dissertation research focused on understanding the effects of climate change on freshwater resources and their management in South Florida. During her PhD, Jessica worked closely with regional stakeholders to understand the context within which regional water management decisions are made. In 2008, Jessica worked as a gubernatorial fellow in the Florida Department of Environmental Protection Office of Water Policy, where she crafted a statewide policy for climate change and water resource management. Jessica has also completed an MA at Columbia University in Climate and Society, and an MED at NYU Biology Education, and a BA in Environmental Science at Barnard College. And with that, we are going to turn the controls over to Jessica in Florida. So bear with us for just a second while we transition here. Okay, Jess, I can see your PowerPoint, and I know we can hear you, so I will let you take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you for joining me today. I couldn't exactly see who was on, but I just saw the number 8, so I'm glad you're here. During today's webinar, I'm going to talk about project C2-1, which is using dynamic information acceleration to understand and forecast homeowner adoption of new technologies. If you tuned into Gary's webinar 2 weeks ago, you learned about adoption of policies at the municipal scale and higher. And today, I'm going to be zooming in closer to the individual scale to try to understand more about human behaviors, including decisions to adopt technologies. I hope that by the end of the webinar, you'll understand why it's important to study individual decision-making and how what we learn about individual decisions might influence policy and communication strategies and what we're doing in our project to further understand decision-making. Okay, but first I want to acknowledge my collaborators on this project, Bob Meyer at the University of Pennsylvania and Kenny Broad at the Abba Center at University of Miami. These two are the driving force behind Choiceflow, which is the research tool I'm going to be talking about today, and Dave Letzen at the University of Miami, who provides economic perspective, which is critical to our project, and then Tim Kirby, who is our wonderful PhD student in his second year at FIU. I also want to acknowledge the help that I've received from Sybil and Mazdek and Sarah and Larry Rosner and Teresa, and there are others who I'm missing, I'm sure, who helped us structure our our research questions for our first experiment. They helped us get videos together, and they helped direct us towards the resources we needed to sort of populate this first experiment. Okay, so just to give you an overview, I'm going to start the webinar by providing a description of behavioral research and what this perspective can offer. It's going to include a quick and dirty review of some of the theory that we draw from in our research. And then I'm going to talk about some of what we already know and what we don't know when it comes to human behavior as it relates to water consumption, water conservation, and adoption of technologies. After this, I'm going to describe our project, and we'll do a run-through of our experiment. Okay. So first, I want to stress the importance of social science research to the study of sustainable water resources. I know Gary already described the rationale for including social science in the UWIN approach, so many of you already have this fresh in mind, why we need social science approaches to understand why or why not conservation is occurring and how well it's working, but I think it's important to state it again. Recent studies have shown that it's not sufficient to have technological solutions. This sort of, if you build it, they will come philosophy does not fit our understanding of how societies transition to sustainable water systems. Increasingly, we recognize the importance of social processes across scales, from the individual to state, in the adoption of technologies. And there are a number of different disciplines within the social sciences that attempt to understand these factors. They're represented here in these outer blue circles. Each field offers a slightly different perspective on questions like those we're looking at in the UWIN project. I represent them here as separate circles, but there's a lot of overlap between these different social science disciplines. For example, political scientists address theory and practice of governance and government politics at the local, state, international scales. They try to understand the institutions and practices that impact water resource use, development, and policy. Science and technology studies, which is a relatively newer field, addresses studies about what makes, oh, oopsie daisy, whoa, what influences, what influences the use of science and the sort of risks that are posed by the communication of science to society. And then cultural anthropologists try to understand the cultural norms and how those influence human relationships to water. So we're pulling from this research, although all these sort of disciplines inform my research. This presentation today is on behavioral research, which pulls from fields of psychology and sociology to try to look at how individuals make decisions and behave around water resources. So we look at questions like, why do water conservation decisions and behaviors matter? And we'll look at what do we already know about those types of human behaviors and how they influence water resource use and what we hope to learn. Okay, so why do water conservation behaviors matter? As all of you are well aware, urban water systems are under assault. The long-term sustainability of our systems are expected to come under further strain in coming decades for several reasons. Climate change, aging water infrastructure, expanding population, and economic growth are several of the challenges. This first map here is from the National Climate Assessment. It shows water supply sustainability risk, which the maroon color shows is extreme in much of the nation. Infrastructure issues are troubling. Baltimore is leaking. In fact, the American Society of Civil Engineers Infrastructure Report Card rated the country's drinking water infrastructure a D and the wastewater infrastructure a D+. And these infrastructure challenges will further exacerbate the difficulty of meeting supply as it changes with increasing demand. And the demand for water has grown consistently, and a growing population and expanding economy are expected to keep demand high for the foreseeable future. Okay, so All these drivers and pressures that we can read about in the literature are consistent with what we hear from our stakeholders during our first 2 years of interactions. This isn't Project C2-1, it's a different project, but I thought I would put this up to show you that our these findings are all based in what we're hearing from stakeholders as we travel across the country. So, this figure, which is in our paper in Water Resources Research, which is in review, shows the diversity of challenges that our stakeholders described on surveys. When we asked them the question, in your opinion, what are the most important challenges or threats to urban water systems in your region? So you can see here climate change, water quality impacts, infrastructure, funding. These are the top of our stakeholders' minds in terms of concerns. And these trends are indicators of an impending water crisis, and they show the need of household level water conservation today. So the good news is that there's room for improvement, and there's substantial reductions remain achievable. So in the United States, we withdraw an average of 98 gallons per capita. For domestic uses, this is a lot more than they do in other countries, and a lot more than the amount that they say is expected to meet basic daily human needs, which is arguably lower than we would ever want to be at, but there's still a lot of room for reductions there. And of course, the consumption rates differ across our UWIN sites, but we're still, high above the average here. South Florida, you can see in this little chart, is doing sort of worse than Sun Corridor and Front Range, and there's a lot of diversity across cities in these regions too. Okay, so a comprehensive study measuring how American households use water, presented by the Water Research Foundation Residential End Uses of Water Study, shows the end uses of water across 1,200 households from 14 North American cities, and this provides a useful sort of snapshot of household level water use. And while indoor water use is relatively stable across regions, outdoor water use varies substantially depending on climate, from 22% as a low in cool, wet regions up to 70% in hotter climates. Those are like the numbers we see here in Florida. Water conservation offers a cost-effective and environmentally benign way to address these challenges in comparison to capturing, transporting, and treating new supplies. So American households can play a vital role by curbing their own water use through installing water-efficient appliances and fixtures and through adoption of conservation habits. Okay, so now we know that there's a problem and that conservation can help. So how? Well, consumer choices and behaviors can have major impacts on water demand. So determining how much water use can be reduced can allow us to demonstrate the role that households can play in contributing to more sustainable water systems. Examples can be found in the greenhouse gas literature through this sort of behavioral wedge approach, which shows, in the overall sort of targeted reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, a small part of that wedge is a behavioral wedge, but this is a substantial and low-cost contribution to the mitigation issue. And we can do the same for water. And in fact, the Pacific Institute has done a study like this, showing that improvements in conservation and efficiency are sort of like the low-hanging fruit, and these offer affordable ways to reduce water demand. So behavioral strategies, in addition to other like regulatory changes, technological options, education, can help reduce demand dramatically. Okay, and so they have done so in the past. These graphs, which are also from the Pacific Institute, show that, in fact, in LA, demand has gone down with conservation. This blue line here compared to what the demand would be with no conservation, and that has resulted from improvements in efficiency, shifts to multifamily homes, new low-flow toilets, shower heads, faucets, efficient appliances, basically reduction in leak rates. These sort of behavioral changes make a major difference. So the difficult part is quantifying the wedge potentials and identifying barriers to strategies and how to overcome those barriers. And that is what we're looking to do with our project. So why don't we conserve more? If it seems relatively easy, why does water use remain so high in the U.S.? Well, the tremendous potential to reduce water use through both efficiency and curtailment. The solution to that problem, there's likely a nuanced reason why we're not conserving as much as we could be, and it's likely to be specific to the household and the type of end use in question. There's likely economic, sociocultural, and informational barriers that all play a part in explaining general patterns in household water use. But here's some of what we know from the literature. Households in many cities lack a strong financial incentive to curb use because water is typically inexpensive. We heard this repeatedly from our stakeholders during our year one interactions as well. This notion that water is too cheap, people don't pay enough for water or pay the true cost of what it takes to get water to people. And these low costs limit household incentives both to improve efficiency and to curtail use. So, why would you pay to purchase a new appliance when the cost, of your water is so low every month, and it might take long to sort of recuperate those savings. One field study funded by the U.S. EPA found that it would cost the typical household about $1,600 to upgrade water-efficient appliances and fixtures, and a payback time of 6 years from savings from water and energy reductions. This is a disincentive to most folks to invest in water-saving appliances. On the curtailment side, there's not an upfront cost, but folks have to sort of put a lot of effort forth and maintain a certain amount of energy to change their behaviors, and they might not see this as worth it when the costs for water are so low. There's also sociocultural factors that shape the degree to which water use and conservations will be sanctioned by society. Here we sort of know things about what we expect from our quality of life, from how we want our yards to look, to how long we want our showers to be. These things affect water use as well. And then we also know from past research that beliefs about water use are flawed and misconceptions are pervasive. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more right now. Shazina Atari found in a survey of Americans, she found that beliefs about water consumption are a major obstacle to effective policy. When asked for the most effective strategy that folks could implement to conserve water, most participants mentioned curtailment, so taking shorter showers, turning off the water while brushing teeth. They mention these actions rather than efficiency improvements like replacing toilets and retrofitting washers, and this contrasts with expert recommendations. This was in a survey of 1,000 participants across the U.S. They also found that folks are more likely to suggest efficiency actions for other Americans and curtailment actions for themselves. So there's a disconnect here in understanding what actually leads to bigger reductions in water use and taking responsibility for those behaviors. Participants underestimated their own water use by a factor of 2 on average, with large underestimates for high water use activities. And older age males were associated with more accurate perceptions. And these findings were a slight improvement over a similar type of research that was done for energy, perceptions of energy use. But still there's a long way to go, and these findings suggest that, you know, well-designed efforts to improve public understanding of household water use could have large payoffs in terms of reduction and improvements in availability of water. So this is a figure from this paper I'm talking about by Shazeen Attari. This just sort of demonstrates what I'm talking about. On the x-axis is actual water used, and the y, this is perception of water used. And she looked at 17 different activities. So the diagonal line here would be a perfect relationship between the two. And what you see is the activities that sort of use more water, people perceive to use less. So this shows that people underestimate, you know, some of the higher water use activities in the home. So what this sort of points to is that efficiency policy must be grounded in an understanding of how people are making decisions. And even if people are motivated, this is not enough to realize environmental gains. Information campaigns need to be improved, and people need to have a better understanding of what actions will lead to the biggest payoffs. And of course, the financial obstacles must be addressed. And you know, I meant to say before, I know that water affordability issues are a real concern, and so that needs to be sort of incorporated into these types of approach too. And as an example, as I was putting this presentation together, I was doing internet search, and I found something about Michael Phelps is, you know, very active in freshwater issues today, and he was actually in an interview talking about how, you know, people should be changing their behaviors drastically to improve water conditions. And he's, you know, his message was about, you know, turning off the water when you brush your teeth and taking shorter showers. And so, not that these actions don't help, but it sort of adds to this body of lack of information, or, you know, incorrect information of the best ways to save water. Furthermore, water-saving tips are usually presented in these long lists that don't prioritize or quantify reductions associated with specific actions, and it's not exactly clear how effective different measures would be, and so there's sort of a limited amount of really solid resources for comprehensive estimates about water savings available in terms of appliance fixture efficiency and changing daily habits indoors, and even more so about the outdoor water use. So now that we've discussed why behavioral approaches matter, let's look at what we already know about decision making that could influence our thinking. Okay, so if we look to the theory from behavioral science, we can find out why certain people make certain decisions and why we behave in different ways. I'm going to go over a few of the basics that inform our thinking on this, but of course, you know, as we collect data and publish this stuff, there'll be a lot more included. So this is just sort of the basics here. Okay, so theory on humans and how we make decisions changed in 1974 when psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman published a piece in Science that changed the traditional view of humans as rational, optimizing decision makers. They hypothesized that we use these heuristics, or sort of rules of thumb or mental shortcuts, to help us make decisions and judgments quickly without having to spend a lot of time analyzing. These are sort of used in intuitive decision making, and again, you know, they're sort of what comes quickly to mind, and they often lead to positive outcomes, but a lot of the literature focuses on the negative outcomes from the use of these heuristics. And 3 examples of these are the availability heuristic, which allows us to assess likelihood based on how quickly something comes to mind, the representativeness heuristic for judging probability that a stimulus sample belongs to a category, and anchoring for quantitative estimates, for example, cost calculations, which may be biased towards some starting value. And you know, if you haven't thought of these things before, they can be kind of fun to sort of think through and test yourself and think about how much, you know, this influences your own decision making. And there's lots of different examples online, but just for demonstration's sake, we'll do one during this little session. Okay, so you can think to yourself, which causes more deaths in developed countries? Traffic accidents or stomach cancer? Homicide or suicide? Okay, so typical guess, people say that traffic accidents are 4 times more likely than stomach cancer, when actually 45,000 traffic deaths to 95,000 stomach cancer deaths occur in the US every year. However, the ratio of newspaper reports on each subject is 137 traffic fatalities to 1 stomach cancer death. So the availability heuristic pushes us to think that because we sort of might hear about these events more, be able to recall these events more because of what we read about in the news or hear about through, you know, discussions of media, makes you sort of have errors in your judgment of frequency. Similarly, you know, because homicide is covered often on the news, we might think that that's more frequent than the suicide rate, which is not the case. So these heuristics can lead to biases in decision making, and as an example, we just went through, availability and representativeness heuristics can lead to biases due to retrievability and instances of imaginability. And these biases can come into play when we're making decisions around water use and technology adoption. So other examples which, you know, if you are interested in these types of things, Wikipedia, actually, there's a really good comprehensive list of all the different sort of decision bias that people discuss. I pulled out some that I think are clearly used in decisions about water. The single action bias, CRED, the Center for Research on Environmental Decision Making at Columbia, pointed out that folks are sort of victim to the single action bias in decision makings, where you might feel overwhelmed or vulnerable about some sort of environmental concern, and after taking one action, that feeling is reduced, and that inhibits you from taking another action, even though you might lead to actual more reductions of either in water use or in energy use. Some of these other ones are probably more obvious to you: the bandwagon effect, the tendency to do or believe things because other people believe the same. The framing effect, which people change their mind about decisions based on, you know, a small difference in wording. And you can imagine, if you start to think about these effects, you know, how communication strategies might be able to take advantage of this knowledge in structuring communications to sort of nudge decisions or behaviors in the right way. Okay, so so we've talked about these different factors that influence decision making: cognitive bias, framing, how a message is framed, who's delivering it, and how. Past experiences with technology or impacts can also impact decisions. You can imagine if somebody purchased an appliance and then was very unhappy with it, it might sort of dissuade them from purchasing other efficient appliances in the future. If you are exposed to some sort of impact, like you invest in your garden and there's a drought and all your plants die and you have a big loss, it might make you more likely to invest in the future. But past experiences influence decisions. Belief in personal relevance is important. Age and individual differences. Wester, a student who studied under Kenny Broad in her dissertation, looked at the factors that influence decisions about reuse or perceptions of reuse, and found that gender and this sort of yuck factor may influence decisions or perceptions about using reused water. And then stages of adoption from the diffusion of innovation literature, where adoption is can be influenced by both community and individual factors, and can be seen as an ongoing process or set of decisions that can be also influenced by characteristics and perceptions of the actual technology itself. Is the effectiveness of it clear? Can people communicate about it to express, the utility of it easily? Can you visualize and see the impacts of these things influence, whether it's adopted or not? Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about what we do know. What don't we know? We don't know what factors influence decisions to adopt greywater systems across UWIN regions. We don't know what information sources are preferred and how different sources of information might influence decisions. And we don't know how likely homeowners are across our regions to adopt and what might make them more likely to adopt. So these are the things we're looking at in our first experiment, and which looks at how greywater system adoption decisions are made by exploring how decisions might be reached and their likely outcomes. Okay, so now we're going to sort of shift into talking about this research project we're doing. So how are we studying the adoption of greywater systems? We're using an online survey which is embedded in the Choiceflow simulation tool, which is a virtual reality-like choice experiment. It's a flexible tool, and it allows for rapid development of these types of studies. We're going to go through the actual simulation of it, so I won't talk too much about what it looks like and what it does, because I'm going to allow you guys to see it yourselves. So just a little bit of background first. It's easy to use programming platform that allows us to predict demand for products and technologies that might not be known to participants or exist. So the reason why you'd use Choiceflow over just a basic survey is it allows participants to learn a little bit about the technology through different sort of resources that they can choose from, and this allows us ultimately to suggest improvements in allocation of resources depending on how people search for information and the type of information that lead to different types of decisions. So this method grew from information acceleration, which is an approach to the information gathering, and choice was pioneered by Glenn Urban and colleagues at MIT. And then Kenny and Bob had a big role in extending these projects to more realistic media choice environments, looking at natural hazards in response to hurricanes and sea level rise. Okay, so what exactly are we looking at in this first experiment? We're looking at, as our dependent variable, the likelihood of adoption of greywater systems over time, and our independent variables are knowledge about, familiarity with the system, level or scale of community adoption, level of distress associated with greywater use, willingness to pay, and then some demographics like age, gender, education, and income. Okay, so if we can, I'd like to run through the simulation now. Let's see. Should work. Can everybody still see this?
Yeah, we can. I can see it, so I assume
Okay.
everybody else too.
Okay. So if you were a participant in this survey, this is you would open up your experiment, and this is what you would see. This is sort of the introduction page, welcomes you to this study. And then there's this pre-experimental survey, which has 7 questions, provides a description about greywater, and then asks some questions about knowledge, about sort of agreement with these different statements, you know, which sort of get at the impacts of greywater and the price of greywater and the ease of operating greywater systems, to try to assess sort of what folks know about it before they engage with the experiment. Would you consider installing a system? What would you be willing to pay? So we want to understand these things before and after people have interacted with the experiment. How would you rate your knowledge? Okay, so then they've completed this intro survey, and they enter into the Choiceflow living room, where then they can go to different sources to learn about greywater systems. So they can go to TV, where they can choose one of 3 videos about greywater. So you can see, for example,
here on the Central Coast, there is a growing push by homeowners to use their recycled bath and laundry water, greywater. But turns out there is a right and a wrong way to do it. A breakdown tonight from Action News reporter Felix Cortez. He's live right now in Monterey.
And Dan, I'm live outside the Monterey Peninsula water.
Okay, so they can. I'm not going to go through all these videos, but if you want to look more closely, you know, I'm happy to share this with you so you can look at it. But basically, they could watch these 3 videos, and the whole time they're interacting with these different interfaces. Data on how they interact with the different media are being recorded, so we can understand, you know, if they spend a lot of time looking at the television and then make certain decisions, the sort of relationship between information search and information use and decisions. They can go to the computer and search and then pull up any one of these different articles on greywater. Okay, consumer reports on the different types of systems and different costs. And then finally, folks can go talk to a neighbor. And this is the video.
A washing machine inside every machine has a pump that pumps out the water right through the discharge hose. And so to set up a greywater system, we just connected this valve to the discharge hose, so we didn't have to change our plumbing at all. And then
So this is meant to sort of represent, you know, a natural environment where you would interact with different information to learn about a system. Okay, and so once they feel like they've explored these information sources enough, they go to an exit survey where we collect similar information but a little bit more detailed on likelihood of installation of a system, willingness to pay, agreement with these different conditions. Again, this is likelihood to purchase. And then factors that will influence the decision. Perceptions of distress. knowledge, and just overall experience with the experiment. Okay, and then demographics. So that's about it on there. And then okay, so again, what we'll get out of this is understanding more about the adoption of this greywater system and factors that influence it. We'll understand preferences for information type and source and how these can influence adoption. And hopefully this will help us to craft policy recommendations that are based on evidence we gather. So where are we in this process? The pilot study is about to go out. It's been held up by just some bureaucratic stuff at FIU dealing with actually getting the contract pushed through our contracts office. Once we analyze the data from our pilot, we're using Qualtrics to populate our sample. And the zip codes that we're using came from Liz, who studied or gathered a list of zip codes from the census on urbanized areas. So based on our data from the pilot, we'll edit the survey a little bit and then decide upon the next sample where we have contracted with Qualtrics to do a number of cities, but we're not sure yet if it makes sense to do it in Miami or just focus on cities where you know, it's more likely that gray water reuse would have a major role in conservation decisions. And then we'll disseminate the experiment again by January and hopefully have all of our results analyzed in February. So that's it. That's all I have for today. Thank you. If you want to follow up with me, I'd be happy to talk more about any of these topics. And also, I should say that you know, if you're interested in using Choiceflow to populate your own experiment, it's relatively easy and it's free. So you can email Bob and he'll arrange an account for you to set up. And there's a number of people to thank, NSF, the Wharton Risk Management and Decision Processes Center, as well as these folks at Wild Pockets. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Mike wants you to know that he's clapping in silence.
Thank you.
So Neil is wondering if there are any comparisons with other cultures, like European countries, as to what their attitudes are compared to ours in the U.S.
Regarding water conservation?
Well, here, let me try unmuting him. Hey, Neil.
Yeah, am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, well, you started out, Jessica, and great presentation, by the way, very interesting. And you started out by talking about how Americans use a lot more water than the other countries.
Yeah.
And seems like, you know, there's different cultures, different attitudes, different value sets in these different countries. And it might be interesting just to know, what are these differences? Why are they using less? Is it purely financial, or is it behavioral, or what is it?
Yeah, yeah. That's a good point.
Do you know of any literature about it or anything like that?
I'm trying to think. I mean, you know, to be honest with you, most of I've read a lot of literature coming out of other countries, but it hasn't necessarily focused on individual level decision making. It's more, you know, how transitions and policy are occurring. So I don't know offhand of that, but it's interesting. It's definitely an interesting point. I'll look into it more.
Yeah, you know, if you think about those countries over there, just taking England, Germany, and France, and Italy, and the Scandinavian countries is just one sample set. They have a lot smaller apartments. You know, they have smaller cars. There's all kinds of factors in it, and I think we're used to wasting a lot just in general in the United States. It's not just water. you know, they do a better job of recycling resources and things like that. And I just wondered if there might be some hidden signals as to things we could look at. Anyway, just a thought. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you know, just socioculturally, this sort of obsession with green lawns and, you know, big yards, and that obviously is a major water consumer. So I would assume that those, you know, those would be visible. And I'll look into it. It's an interesting point for sure.
Yeah, Mary's pointing out a couple things here. I'm going to try to unmute Mary if she's near her microphone. Mary, can we hear you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is, you know, in my classes sometimes we talk about this, and Cynthia Barnett has a book called The Blue Revolution, in which she talks about water use in America. But I think Neil pointed out, you know, in many places the density of development, you know, people live in apartments, so they don't have individual lawns. The places where, you know, a lot of European cities, you know, they've already gone through retrofitting, you know, because they're very old, and so they're new, and they were relatively dense when they started installing modern appliances. So those modern appliances use less water. They heat water at the point of use rather than having these big tank water heaters, and they're not watering lawns. So I would say that the combination of not watering lawns and not having like a washing machine in every household.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know, if you've ever chaperoned teenage girls on American girls and young people in general take long showers. And I don't think that is the same cultural practice in every country.
Yeah.
You can unmute me. Or mute me.
Okay, I'm going to silence you. Well, I haven't seen any other questions pop up, so thanks for your time today, everybody, and thank you, Dr. Bolson, for a wonderful presentation. We'll get that uploaded to YouTube, and be sure to join us next week for a presentation from Dr. Greg here at Colorado State University.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, guys.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.